done more anything I could have asked for.
That's great. That's really nice.
Mike, they
Sign up there with some of these posters that are available for sale.
he never stops, you know, he's now,
Yeah.
Arcade was
It's okay. I know we had that one. We had the wow.
The guys do that.
And he did one on that.
You got one of those, but
I believe that's some of those check.
the picture of Rosie, you know, the.
That one unfortunately don't have.
It got into the
Because there's still,
automotive.
there's the licensing issue for that one.
Oh, is there?
Well,
We did a lot of research.
it's difficult to use and affordable somewhat. He's
Okay.
83.
But the wow, yeah.
Mike, really? Oh, yes, I went to the.
He's got a snowstorm day in my office one. He came in, it was just snow, blizzard outside. He sat there for 8 hours going through photos.
No, he's just got amazing energy. I hope I'm still there.
I'd probably wait a little bit
At that
after.
time, if I still hear this.
Roads are so screwed
But
up.
I also hope that I am too.
I'm sure some people.
2 more years I'll be in Texas.
But yeah, next year.
They went around, I remember, I had to work on the street with Shakespeare. I said, I found this one, the back street.
My wife's in Texas and I'm going to Texas as well.
Well, between the University of Corvette
Yes, ma'am.
and Mustang.
You got your pin on.
I'm done. She's doing it, not me.
How many years did you work there?
I think it was 3 years.
Okay.
Your
Yeah.
last name isn't Purdy, is it?
I ended up over where the barracks were in the end.
We've got a nice picture of the barracks right here in the other room.
Well, when I was there, they had Italian prisoners there. And we were warned never to go up to that fence.
My uncle did. They used to play a game for cigarettes.
Yeah, I thought that was out there.
That's true, that's right.
Right on fence. I went there was from the Italian prisoners. Yeah. And then they had
And then we
tanks
changed.
in the back.
Halfway through, we changed.
And they used to take the tanks up to the tanker proving grounds to test them.
Give them a hand. Very nice.
I think they moved the track up there when they put in the barracks.
Well, I guess we'll go ahead and get started. If anybody straggles in because of the construction, we'll just see them as they arrive. Yes, thank everybody for coming. I know it's a bit of a challenge. Yesterday, you could still get across, and then they just had to pour the cement, and so now you can't get across.
Thanks for the notice.
Yes, it was but I guess on the positive side, it means that they're getting close to being done, and hopefully we'll soon be able to access without any kind of technical issues. All right, well, good afternoon. My name is Chris Bosley, and I'm the president of the Michigan Military Technical and Historical Society. Our museum's mission is to highlight the Michigan's contribution to the 20th century conflict. This is an all-volunteer organization, so we thank everybody for coming, and hopefully you will get a chance to see our museum if you haven't already. Let us know what you think. I'd like to point out that there, on the seats there are some upcoming events. One thing I want to point out is our World War II roundtables, which are going to be pointed on monthly, first Saturday of the month at 4 o'clock. We have a number of interesting topics coming up, and so keep an eye on the museum's website and for what we have going on. But then, without any further delay, I'd like to introduce Randy Talbot, the
Command historian.
official command historian for TACOM. Yes, sir. So, thank you, Chris. First off, before I begin, I want to thank Chris not only for inviting me up, but also for this wonderful place he's put together. I've known Chris for, 12 years now, Chris? Yes. And the very first time we met, Chris came into my office and asked him where they could do a model display. models. Good shot, Chris. You did a great job. I'm really proud of you. And you don't slides for me, right, Chris?
Yeah.
All right, go to the next one, if you would. What I want to do today is take a different approach on the arsenal of democracy than maybe what you've heard before. Now, I'm humbled by some of the people that are here today because they know more than I'm ever going to learn about this. However, I'm going to try anyway. In the very early days of World War II, industrial manufacturers in Detroit began a complete revitalization of their product lines, from automobiles and refrigerators to airplanes, weapons of war. What became synonymous with the arsenal of democracy? Forgotten in all that massive military buildup was one Army organization that was a linchpin directing this massive production. The Army organization still exists today in Metro Detroit, is still directing the military vehicle systems of today's armed forces. This is the story of that command and what it has done in the last 70 years in supporting our troops and defending our nation. So let's take a look at where TACOM LCMC is today. That stands for Life Cycle Management Command. Then we're going to jump back to 1940 and look at the Army and what it had to do to solve the crisis in the beginning of World War II. Basically, if you will, taking a macro and then a micro view and then bring us back up to today. If we have time, I've got some backup slides that I'd like to show you of vehicles. And since this is a technical museum, I thought showing you World War II vehicles and what their counterparts are today would kind of be interesting to show you the difference in vehicle design and technology and stuff that we have. Next slide, Chris. I'm required to do these, so I will. Every organization needs a mission and a vision. Otherwise, you're never sure if you're meeting the benchmarks that you need to in an organization. Basically, what we strive for is to design, produce, and field the most technologically advanced combat and support systems for our nation's armed forces. Due to the vast number of systems that we're responsible for, as a command, we touch every soldier every day. Chris? Next one. In equipping the soldier, this gives you an idea of what we do. Our organization relies on core competencies of acquisition, logistics, and technology to fulfill the life cycle management construct. As you can see, our magnitude is at the very heart of our force structure, supplying 60% of the equipment of the brigade combat team, which is now the main maneuver force within the Army. Our product lines are as diverse as our Army, from robots to bridges, to ground combat support vehicles, to tools and construction equipment. Next. The purpose of the TACOM Lifecycle Management Command is revealed in our name. We're responsible for the complete life cycle of vehicles, equipment, weapons, and supplies used by U.S. soldiers on the ground. From concept through production, deployment to disposal, every aspect of creating and maintaining equipment for our forces is managed by the TACOM Lifecycle Management Command. The heart of our work is the very heart of our forces, of our armed forces and our soldiers. Our job is to protect the lives of our soldiers and give them everything they need to do their job efficiently, effectively, and above all, safely. For 70 years, our command has had one focus, and that's giving them the very best. With this as a short outline of who we are at TACOM Lifecycle Management Command, let's take a trip back to 1940 and see how we came to be who we are today. Historians' job is to answer questions, and the one question that bothered me since I came to this command is why we were here. It seemed that there was something missing in our history, and it just wasn't making sense to me. And the answers I received, well, they were less than satisfying. They brought up more questions. And there's people like Dr. Hyde and Art Pope and Mr. Lampier who have, over the years, have been feeding me with stuff and have given me more reason to keep digging and keep digging and keep digging. So to understand where we are today, you've got to go back to where we were, to where we started. The position of this command in the Army structure is one that resembles the ever-changing nature of warfare, changes in force structure and advances in technology and processes that force change in organizational structure and realignment of missions. For 70 years, the command has been at the forefront of modernization of the Army, of changes in force structure and how the Army fights and goes to war. Ironically, despite all these changes the command has seen in the last 70 years, the mission remains virtually unchanged. In essence, we are the Army's first life cycle management command. The story of how we came goes back to the early days of 1940 when Europe was at war and it was a question if the United States would even enter the war. So let me begin with a few problems facing the Army at the start of World War II and the attempts to solve these problems and why our command was established.
At the onset, let me give you a little piece of myth making. In Warren, the Army built the Detroit Arsenal to house the first tank plant. Tank production would become synonymous with the arsenal of democracy. Organizationally, it first reported to Ordnance Corps and then to what would become TACOM, not the other way around. People still confuse that you know, we are owned by them or whatever, it is the other way around. So, but interestingly, all of this almost didn't happen. Next slide, please. In 1940, the Army and the country, for that matter, had to look at the possibility the United States would enter war. At the time, the Army had about 170,000 soldiers, a hollow Marine Corps, a Navy that scraped together what it could from the World War II fleet, or World War I fleet, I'm sorry. As a country, we ranked about 16th in the world behind such military powers as Holland and Bulgaria. Budget constraints forced the military by the Great Depression saw shortages in men, material, equipment, ammunition, vehicles, ships, and airplanes. Maneuvers conducted in the Army saw soldiers carrying broom handles as rifles, and placards were placed on trucks with the word tank on them. In upstate New York, good humor trucks served as enemy vehicles. In reality, the military was nothing more than a constabulary force. It was during this period that the Chief of Staff of the Army, George C. Marshall, and his policy planning branch began designing requirements to mobilize an Army then in World War II. Originally labeled the Victory Plan, it looked at every aspect of the Army, its size, equipment, uniforms, arms, ammunition requirements, and everything else that goes into building a planned Army for 216 divisions. With an Army of just a few divisions and none of them at full strength, the task in front of Marshall was daunting. Just to give one example, there was no facility in the United States that had the knowledge, expertise, or manufacturing capacity or capability to build needed tanks, trucks, or other military vehicles. To fulfill the requirements of an Army, there had to be a massive economic mobilization program of industry to tap into their production capacity. Recent scholarship has challenged the making of the Army's Victory Plan that it was impossible to fulfill. There was not enough raw material, manufacturing capacity, workforce, man-hours, and budget to support the plan, let alone raw material. Economists put forth a more realistic plan of 100 divisions, and that's exactly what the Army built. If you ever get a chance to find and see this book, it's called Keep From All Thoughtful Men. And this is a discussion about how economists changed the Army's decision of how many divisions they were going to have and laid it out for them where we ended up with 100 divisions. Now, all of these issues are political ones and can only be solved at a political level. The Army needed both political leaders and industrialists to come together for the nation's war effort. Next slide, please. Organizationally, Marshall had another dilemma, but this one he could change. To begin with, the Ordnance Corps was responsible for design and procurement of tanks. Quartermaster Corps was responsible for design and procurement of light vehicles, and Transportation Corps had responsibility for heavy transport vehicles. Marshall's decision was that the Army needed a central organization to manage all vehicle procurement, production, design, research, development, and engineering. All responsibilities were shifted from the technical services to ordnance in Washington. This started an Army reorganization that placed a multitude of functions under one roof, but still didn't solve the problem. Anyone know how the Jeep came about? Anyone want to take a guess at how the Jeep was developed?
Contest between several manufacturers, wasn't it, Randy?
Right.
Bantam, Willis, Ford.
The way it came about went something like this. The testing was done at Hull Brand. It was Hull Brand Arsenal outside of Baltimore. Is that right, Art? Hull Brand?
Yeah.
And Ford and Willys failed the test. Bantam passed. But Quartermaster had already decided to build a Chevrolet 1.5-ton truck and didn't want the Jeep. So the guy from Bantam ended up going into Walter Beetle Smith's office, Marshall's chief of staff, saying, I got an idea for a lightweight reconnaissance car. All-terrain, lightweight, everything else. And so Beetle goes into Marshall's office and says, hey, we got this idea, this guy's willing to do it. And Marshall said, buy it. So that's what they ended up doing. But there becomes a dilemma because now you've got the Ordnance Corps the Quartermaster who doesn't want it. Nobody wants to purchase it, and they don't think that, the Army doesn't think that Bantam can build what they need. So the problem then becomes who's going to manage it, produce it, procure it, field it, and get it to Army units. The Jeep passed the test, so what the Army did was, and I should say what the quartermaster did, was gave the plans for the Jeep to Willys and subcontracted to Ford, so that Ford and Willys built the Jeep and left Bantam out in the cold. Bantam eventually did get a contract for about, I think it was 1,200 or 1,400 Jeeps total, and all those went on Lend-Lease and they were done producing by 1941. So the dilemma becomes, you've got 3 companies building the same vehicle in 3 different plants in Detroit, Toledo, Ohio, and Butler, Pennsylvania. Issues with quality control, production quotas, spare parts come to mind, as does the contracting and purchasing, distribution, maintenance, and everything else. And during World War II, the Army ended up buying 660,000 Jeeps. Next slide. As the Army began mobilizing, it was not set up to handle the vast production, distribution, and logistics functions needed for a modern Army. So the first 1942 reorganization was known as the Marshall Reorganization. The War Department established 3 major commands: Ground Forces, Air Forces, and Service Forces. And General Somerville was named the commanding general of the Service Forces. This was somewhat similar to the services of supply that General Pershing had during World War I, the Expeditionary Force, and would end up causing a lot of problems later on in the war because logistics couldn't meet the needs of the Army in the field. Service Forces became the common agency for procurement and supply for the Army, both in the U.S. and overseas during training and in combat. It was also the common agency for research and development of ground equipment. Somerville had oversight of 7 technical services such as quartermaster, ordnance, transportation, as well as a geographically based service commands, or what we would call today's theater support commands. The chiefs of technical services had dual roles, which sometimes caused friction. Services did procurement and distribution, and they did technical supervision within their commodity area, and it was not always clear what was the Bureau's responsibility or the technical service responsibility. So to solve the question of responsibility, Somerville transferred all procurement, supply, engineering, research, development, and many other functions of the technical services under the Ordnance Corps for both stability and continuity of vehicle systems. Marshall's reorganization set in motion a further reorganization in 1942. General Campbell began the consolidation and decentralization of the Army's vehicle fleet. Taking all the automotive organizations within quartermaster, ordnance, and transportation, namely vehicle design, research, development, production, storage, issue, procurement, Campbell integrated the automotive experts from the Army with the automotive experts of Detroit and put them all in one organization, namely the Tank Automotive Center, which is where we come in. Campbell believed that to build all the vehicles needed for the Army, it could only be done through the industry ordnance partnership. Basically taking the Army's experts and mixing them up with the automotive experts here in Detroit. The Tank Automotive Center was to coordinate the needs and requirements of a vast and growing military with the production capacity of the automotive industry, combining vehicle design, procurement, production, research, development, spares, replacement parts, distribution, publications, maintenance, or as we call it today, life cycle management or fleet management. Put it all under one roof, enable the Army to quickly take requirements, drawings, research, development, and testing, and roll that into contracts all in the same place. Having it all in Detroit made it easier to deal directly with the automotive industry, made them a partner in the decision-making process. For example, there's 26 separate committees that the Tank Automotive Center worked with regarding production, such as an engine committee, rolled armor plate committee made up of producers and fabricators, the wood cargo body committee, a winches committee, and a rubber production committee, to name just a few. Next slide, please. So what was needed was an organization that can coordinate the needs of a growing military and the production capacity of the automotive industry in Detroit. Not only the automotive industry, but really all industry. The organization became the Tank Automotive Center, which would later become TACOM. It became the critical link between the Army's mobilization needs and Detroit's automotive industry. The new Tank Automotive Center was housed in the Union Guardian building in downtown Detroit, and Alfred Glancy, former vice president of GM, and I think Pontiac as well, became a brigadier general and was appointed to command the center. His combined automotive and government experience exemplified the synergy between military and industry that made the arsenal of democracy such a success. When it was first formed in 1942, the Army transferred 40 officers and about 600 civilian employees from Washington, D.C. to Detroit to man the organization. By the end of the war in 45, there was a staff of 500 officers and more than 4,000 civilians working at the Tank Automotive Center. Not surprisingly, the organization experienced growing pains, communication problems, inefficiencies, and a host of reorganizations and realignments necessary to handle this center's ever-burgeoning demands. Clancy liked to set things up almost in a pyramid. So you had so many committees and organizations trying to get to him to make a decision regarding production that it became unwieldy, and he ended up leaving. They say it was for ill health, and others say because him and General Campbell didn't get along, and he didn't get along with his deputy, who was a guy named General Christmas, who was the guy that designed and built all the tanks that we had prior to 1940 in Rock Island. Next slide, please. These are the missions that the TACOM Automotive Center and later the Office Chief of Ordnance Detroit had, and they're pretty similar to what we had today. For example, we're responsible for acquisition logistics functions. We still have that today. At the end of the war, the Office Chief of Ordnance Detroit was the largest of the district's material divisions, coordinating the production and fielding of a staggering number of tanks and motor vehicles. You know, by 1945, it was estimated that there was approximately one vehicle for every 4 soldiers. The center was the brain of vehicle production and supply for the war effort. Over the course of the war, the center was responsible for over 3 million total vehicles, representing an expenditure of $15 billion at that time, or roughly $3 trillion in today's money. The combined effort of military and industrial knowledge transformed the Army's methods of supplying troops effectively and efficiently and made an indispensable contribution to Allied victory. During World War II, the Tank Automotive Center spent about 50% of all the funds allocated to the Ordnance Department and directed the production, like I said, of 3 million vehicles ranging from bicycles to 70-ton tanks. The center even ran its own publishing operation, producing more than 2 billion pages of maintenance and technical manuals in the last year of the war alone. In 1944, was after Clancy left, it was renamed the Office Chief of Ordnance Detroit, put more in line with all the other ordnance organizations. And the original motto was more than enough on time whenever needed, and we're still using parts of that where we're trying to have like just-in-time delivery, on-time delivery, and things of that nature. Next slide. So how does the Tank Automotive Center fit into the Ordnance District structure? Detroit was first of all responsible for all procurement in the state of Michigan. So every single plant and facility within the state of Michigan were the ones that did their contracting for and sent the requirements to them for building. Like the other Ordnance District, Detroit contracted this area first for all tank and automotive vehicle systems. This included the automotive company's second and third tier manufacturers and the Detroit Arsenal tank plant. But the Detroit Office Chief of Ordnance Detroit also had national responsibilities for the same areas as well, and it coordinated production from a number of facilities and companies for a specific vehicle through the Ordnance District. So what would happen is we would get the requirements, and say if the facility is out in Renton, Washington, it's going to be building the tank, we would do the original contracting and everything else and send it out to Renton for them to go ahead and coordinate with the plant itself. During World War II, there were 7 different variants of the M4 Sherman tank. 5 made for the American military, 1 for the Canadians, 1 for the British. Additionally, 11 plants and 6 ordnance districts produced the Sherman in Michigan, Ohio, Illinois, New Jersey, Washington, Montreal, Philadelphia, and New York. This included locomotive companies and the Big Three. The Office Chief of Ordnance Control coordinated the purchase, production, distribution of depots and arsenals as well, and for modification and storage into shipping ports for overseas European and Pacific. Next slide, please. This is a slide people don't usually see, but if you look at all the stars and you start just counting the stars, it'll give you an idea of where the Army is today and the whole military. This is what we refer to as the organic industrial base during World War II. These are all the depots and arsenals and facilities like that we used in World War II. Originally, depots and arsenals built during World War II had to be established within a 200 miles of an international border, which is why the Detroit Arsenal almost didn't get built and why Detroit almost wasn't able to do any kind of production work. And Marshall had to give special dispensation to allow Detroit to do that. Bill Knudsen is one of the guys that got him on that, so you can't do it without Detroit, so they rescinded that to allow the Detroit Arsenal to be built where they've built now. But does anyone know the difference between a depot and an arsenal? No takers. Depots store vehicles, add upgrades, do modifications, and do refurbishment work. And arsenals actually do production work. For example, Waterville Arsenal in upstate New York is the Army's cannon factory. It actually has the ability to bore tubes and guns. Actually, they still do that up there on a daily basis to include mortar tubes. Rock Island Arsenal has the Army's only foundry that's still operational today. But if you look at this closely, you can see what commonly referred to as the cooling of the organic base. And this is something that's happening within the military today and within the United States. We only have 22 of the original 50 arsenals and depots left. And because of base realignment and closure, many of those have been closed down or realigned to do, for other capacities or capabilities. For some of them, parts for some systems are no longer available, and manufacturers are moving production to more profitable profit lines and no longer in business or were bought out. That's the other side of the coin. If, we use a lot of the industry factories to do a lot of production work for the military, and they're getting away from that. Systems that we've had for 30, 40 years, there's no more parts for them. And so we have to almost reverse engineer the parts, make them, figure out how to make them ourselves at one of the depots and arsenals. And it's really not cost productive to do that, especially if you think you need one part, you've got to retool the whole thing to make one part. It's not cost effective for the Army to do that, but then again, industry's not doing it either. So budget cuts are diminishing, they're cutting into the workloads that we do at the depots and arsenals. Diminishing workload means diminishing manpower. And this is one of our concerns today because both the industrial and commercial bases are starting to shrink. And right now, TACOM controls 6 of the depots and arsenals, and I'll talk about them a little bit. Anyone have any questions so far? Or am I boring the living heck out of you with all this stuff? Because if that's boring, next slide. One of the solutions the Army came up with was to build the tank. Like I said, originally, there was no facility. Tanks were built by hand, one at a time, at Rock Island Arsenal, about the only place to build, and a couple of other places. But there was no assembly line expertise or anything, and so they had to go to the auto industry to do this. There was no way around it. So, Chrysler engineers, the oft-told story that they never saw a tank before. I kind of question that because newsreels for 20 years have been showing tanks. Movies have shown tanks. So, for them to say that, I'm not sure, if that's myth or legend. But anyway, they ended up going to Rock Island, looking at the new tank that we were building, brought the blueprints back, and started building and started designing a new tank. At the same time, the Army decided to go ahead and build a $21 million plant for mass production of tanks. This was the first plant actually built solely for the production of tanks. Each tank that came out of the plant originally would cost $33,500. Other than Chris, does anyone else know? Does anyone know how much a tank costs today? You want to take a wild guess at what? And I'll be appropriate, and I'll say it the right way. The M1A2 SEP V2.
Over $1 million.
Too low.
But it's over 10 million.
5 million? Oh, my God.
$5 million for the new tanks that we have right now. If we were to buy them today, that's what they would want.
33,000 then, huh?
Yeah, but the capability between a Grant and an M1, I'm telling you, it was no difference. Firepower alone and everything else. Anyway, Albert Kahn is the guy that designed the plant, like he did many plants, not only here but overseas, also in Europe. Somebody told me one time that his people did all the bases in the island hopping campaign with the Seabees, so they were like right behind the forces going in, building the bases right behind them. But they decided to build this in Warren, Michigan, and Warren had been known as the winter rhubarb capital of Michigan. And I'm from New England, I don't know rhubarb, but that's what Warren was known for. Was when roughly they started in August of 1940 with the groundbreaking of the facility. On October 24th, 1941, the very first tank came across the production line and came out to about 2,000 guest employees, general dignitaries. you know, running over telephone poles and everything else, breaking up stuff, and people were quite thrilled and everything else until they realized that another tank was right behind it. So they had built 2 tanks within the first 8 months, and most of that construction was done with windows, with not even the sides of the building. As you can see in the bottom picture, it's February 41, they still don't even have the sides in. They're just starting to put in all the jigs and fixtures and everything else and tools that were needed. For the first year or so, the actual heating was done by a locomotive inside the plant. Train tracks were right inside the plant. They had a locomotive there to provide heat until they could build the power plant, which didn't come in until about 43, 44, somewhere around there. Within the first year the tank plant was built, they had only delivered about 500 tanks. And then Roosevelt wanted, and again, the country needed them to step up production. So what they did was, and I just find this absolutely amazing, is without stopping production of the M3, they automatically opened up the line and started retooling and building the M4 Sherman. 30 or 40 years later, they did the same thing with the M60 and the M1 tank in the same place. They never stopped production of the 60 while they were building the M1 Abrams. The plant itself measures about 1.1 million square feet, covering an area of 5 city blocks and requiring about 1,000 machine tools and 8,500 specialized jigs and fixtures. And the new plant would be the largest of its kind in the world. A lot of the construction and stuff was done during the wintertime, like I had said. Within the first year, they had produced about 2,000 tanks in the first year and a half. Detroit Offshore Tank Plant became the home of the M4 Sherman, and by war's end, 5 assembly lines would be working around the clock 7 days a week building tanks. It employed about 230 hourly workers in 41. Within a year, nearly 5,500 people made up the workforce of the plant, working 3 shifts, 7 days a week. 23% of the workforce were women, and 10% were African American. And this is something I always found really, really interesting, and I thank Chris for finally showing me what a real one looked like, because I've only seen pictures of it. The plant was awarded the very first Army-Navy E award. Some say that it was actually, the award was made for the tank plant because of the production that they were doing was far superior than any other plant. The Army-Navy E is for excellence, and part of the motto of the command today is committed to excellence, so we still take that as part of what we are today. Next slide.
Randy?
Yes.
Just an observation that I think is worth pointing out. Today, building a plant like that requires years. And at a time when our country wasn't even in war, they were able to do that in 6 months. The difference and the lesson learned, I think, is government intervention, regulation, just the bureaucracy that we've acquired over the years. And I think it's something we've all got to guard against.
And the oversight, which I think...
Oversight is bureaucracy.
You have your normal bureaucracy, which is there to keep the bureaucracy in place, and then you have oversight of that bureaucracy, which I think is even worse, because then it makes things last even longer. And actually, I'll show you that later on, but it actually looks like laid out when we talk about how do you build a vehicle today. If you can see from this list, many different companies were involved in tank production. They included tractor manufacturers, train car and locomotive companies, and the auto manufacturers, and 2 companies in Canada. This is just the main list. This is not the list of all the companies that had work farmed out to the 2nd and 3rd tier suppliers, or who they also contracted with to do it. If you've ever seen, I think this was 3,500 parts of an M4 Sherman, 3,500 or 35,000, something like that, all laid out. Think of that, you're pumping out 6,000 tanks in a year of how they're getting all the parts to the plant at one time to build it and never stop the production line. This is absolutely fascinating. Next slide. This shows fairly interesting things regarding the industrial base and production capacity. First, after 1942, tank production facilities declined yearly while tank production increased. By the time the Allied forces launched the invasion of Normandy, tank production and facilities declined by about 50%. And there's a reason for this, and that's what I was showing you in that book, Keep from All Thoughtful Men, is that when the original plan for 200 production had already reached almost its total goal. By 1943, if I'm not mistaken, we had already outproduced Germany and Britain in what they would produce for the whole world. Detroit Arsenal alone produced 25% of all the tanks the U.S. Army built during World War II, out of just one plant. The other 16 plants built the other 75%. And it would also, alone, outproduce Germany and Great Britain. If you look at the very last bullet, 1943, the tank plant built more tanks than in 1960 to 1972 combined, and we're the only manufacturer building the M60 tank. And its high mark for monthly production is more than was built between 1980 and 1990 when we were building the M1 tank and the M60 at the same time. Between 1957 and 1991, the United States never had more than 2 plants at any one time producing tanks. And in many of those years, it was just the Detroit Arsenal tank plant that built them. Other vehicles like weapons carriers, ambulances, prime movers, tank transporters were built by either the big 3 or subsidiary companies or companies that made trucks. Do me a favor, Chris, can you minimize that? Remember we talked about that? I want to show you guys something that's going to be hard to see, and I want you to go ahead and pull up the Excel spreadsheet in the bottom. Here. That'll give you an idea of what tank production looked like during World War II. Each company, by year, by model of tank that they built.
A lot of variety.
Some of them really only built up, like Delaware really didn't come on board until the 1950s, as did Cleveland. You know, Cadillac was out of the business by the end of World War II, building tanks. You know, Detroit Arsenal is the only one, like I said, that produced from World War II. Basically, the M3, M4, M47, M48 manufacturing, M26, M46, M60, A1, 2, and 3, and the M1. Abrams tanks. That's what was built out of the Detroit Arsenal tank line. You can go ahead and scroll it down if you want, Chris. But if you look at some of the totals on the bottom by year, how many tanks were built, I don't think we can do that today with our production capacity. Just an idea. Go back to the slides, Chris. And we talk about tanks, and we should never forget all the other things that were built as well. You know, hubcap manufacturers made helmets, and typewriter companies made machine guns. Wurlitzer pianos made compasses, and a company named International Silver made Browning automatic rifles. Go to the next chart. I said, if you look at this, you can see the beginnings of the impact of industrial mobilization. In 1942, you look at 1941, we built 4,000 tanks. By 1942, we had built almost 30,000, or 43, we built almost 30,000. But also by 1943, industry produced 6 million rifles, 98,000 bazookas, 648,000 trucks, 33 million pairs of cotton drawers, and 61 million pairs of woolen socks. Stockpiled in England prior to D-Day were 301,000 vehicles, 1,800 train locomotives, 20,000 rail cars, 2.6 million small arms, 2,700 artillery pieces, 300,000 telephone poles, as we knew we were going to destroy the entire infrastructure, 7 million tons of gasoline, oil, lubricants, and 60 million K rations. Just for D-Day alone, we think about printing capacity, we used roughly 3,000 tons of map for D-Day. Next slide. Like I said earlier, tanks was just one of the aspects of the Office Chief of Ordnance Detroit. No matter how you look at it, the numbers are just staggering. Between 42 to 45, the organization was responsible for adding an average of 1 million vehicles per year to the Armed Forces inventory. This included lend-lease, shipments, modifications, and filling the requirement for the Army, Marines, and the Air Force. Of the 13 ordnance districts, on that map we showed of all the districts, Detroit produced about half of all ordnance equipment, with the other 50% being distributed amongst 12 other ordnance districts, so they roughly did about 4% of the business that we did. responsible for nearly 100% of all tanks, combat vehicles, transport systems, NBC gear, detectors, uniforms, protective gear, small arms, crew served weapons, water and fuel purification systems, and the Army's fleet of boats. Does anyone know who has more boats, the Army or the Navy? Anyone want to take a guess?
Probably the Army.
Army's got more hulls than the Navy does. The only thing that we don't do is missiles, aviation, which is helicopters, ammunition, or communications gear. We even got the mission for guard dogs, believe it or not. That's how vast our things are. So you see that our experience and mission have not changed. As a matter of fact, we've become larger and more encompassing for the entire Army. Next slide. Excuse me one second. With a 3-year budget of $15 billion, you can see not only what we did, but what we were responsible for. Technical publications include technical manuals, technical bulletins, maintenance manuals, Army Motors, or today's PS Magazine, and Ordnance Art, to name a few. In 1945 alone, we published something like 2 billion pages of material, making the Office Chief of Ordnance Detroit the largest publishing house in the country. Bigger than Random House, bigger than Macmillan, bigger than Dell, any of the other companies out there. We built, we actually produced more. Spare parts production is a huge job for us in World War II. It's still a huge job today. Shipping 43 depots, arsenals, modification centers, and debarkation points across the country kept vehicles moving and spare parts in the pipeline. Battle-damaged vehicles could be repaired and in the field and returned to the fight within days. Prior to D-Day, spare parts warehouses in England boasted 1.5 million separate parts, including hundreds of parts common. And this is not including assemblies, transmissions, or engines. In addition to all this, OCOD designed and developed nearly 200 vehicles in 3 years. To give you an idea, we built roughly, if you would think about that, 66 vehicles a year, brand new. That's about 6 vehicles less than what Ford, GM, and Chrysler and their subsidiary companies built in 2013. Next one. After World War II, Detroit Arsenal became a government-owned and operated facility. Production of tanks was suspended. The Office Chief of Ordnance in Detroit was transferred to the Detroit Arsenal and then dismantled. The nation settled in for some hard-earned peace and prosperity. This lasted for about 5 years until the United States entered the Korean War. And American fears were that communism would spread and prompted officials to take action. As in 39, say what?
I was just talking about the C3 line there.
Yes.
Well, they just took sand and went right over the top of it.
One of my favorites. Okay. As of 1939, the United States was unprepared for conflict. The Detroit Arsenal tank plant rushed to modify World War II tanks that could still be used until a new tank could be developed. So what we did is we took the M26 Pershing, we did some modifications on it, changed the turret, called it an M46, and sent it overseas. And a whole bunch of M26s. We took the M4 Shermans, we redid the suspension, and we sent them over. That became the M4A3E8 HVS. I hate that. So what we ended up doing was we again brought in Chrysler to go ahead and run the tank plant, and they reconstituted the command once again. It became the what was once the Office Chief of Ordnance Detroit is now the Ordnance Tank Automotive Center. And basically they said replicate the work, but they didn't set up the ordnance districts that they had during World War II. Now one place was going to be responsible for all procurement within the United States. Having learned the valuable role the industry could play, like I said, brought in Chrysler. Chrysler built the M47 tank in 2 years, made 3,443 of them, and you never saw action anywhere. Because none of them were done being built until 1953 by the time the war ended. But the Korean War galvanized the American concerns over the spread of communism. The Cold War began in interest. The Detroit Arsenal was not returned completely to government hands, but instead was expanded to spheres of the war. The Soviets prompted military buildups by both nations. The arsenal increased in size to 340 acres. We also started building a new engineering, research, and test facilities. Originally, they had 2 or 3 test facilities inside the tank plant, that was it. And during the end of the war, they grew a little bit more. But in the 1950s, we started building the entire, what we call now the Tank Automotive Research and Development Engineering Center. A complex over there for them to do research and development. And that started in the 1950s. In 1960, yes, sir.
Did production completely cease for a number of years between the end of World War II and the start of the Korean conflict?
Well, it's not, yeah, production ceased. We didn't build anything. We did a lot of modifications. Like we modified.
So there was a period where there were no new tanks rolling off the line.
Not only was there no new tanks, there was no command, there was no nothing there. It was just an arsenal, and that was it. There, you know, old timers. One of our fellows, one of the guys that started working here in 1946, just retired a couple of years ago. And you know, he talks about, yeah, my first job was going through all the records and you know, sending them off to records holding areas and everything else, closing down the Detroit shop. But yeah, there was some remanufacturing, some remodeling of tanks, but that's about it. There wasn't, because Chrysler was gone. I mean, they'd taken their workers and gone back to building cars, and you leave things up to the Army. We don't build things real well. We don't make them soldier-proof. So anyway, by 1960 is when Chrysler, after the pre-war, Chrysler stayed in the tank plant, and by 1960 they built the first L-60 tank. And by the time the production run ended in the late 1980s, early 1990s, they built roughly 14,400 M60 tanks within a 25-year period. Next. As Cold War buildup continued, America prepared for a possible war, and we became, and the role of the command changed when we actually became now the Tank Automotive Command in '67, and we now manage all contracts and work for the Army vehicles and equipment. Also, defense contractors started producing Army-designed weapon systems and vehicles. It was no longer the Army who was designing things, but it was now specific military contractors who were doing it. By the time that we had become TACOM, you know, in Vietnam, we had about 500,000 troops that were over there. And after, you know, years of bloody conflict, we finally withdrew there from 1973. During the time over there, TACOM managed everything within the Army except for helicopters and planes. The one thing that we managed that was probably one of the better vehicles we built was the M113 armored personnel carriers I showed down below, a very early model from like 1959, 1960. And we built roughly 18,000 of these things throughout its life cycle. As a matter of fact, it's still in the life cycle, Chris, but it's about to come out, right? We're about to get those out of there. So we've been using these now for over 50 years. And improved the workforce in Vietnam, especially in both defensive and offensive roles. And we were building the M60 tank. We never sent the M60 tanks over to Vietnam. We had to use the M48 tanks. M60 was too heavy for the ground over there. Interestingly, it was also a time of changing vehicle design, and also we started doing a lot of experimentation. So you notice the vehicle up top. Because we started playing around with articulated vehicles, and we tried to make vehicles that could do everything. I have this great picture in my office of this Jeep with pods on the side of it and rotors on the top of it, 2 patients, and you know, guns on the inside that are fired on, automatic loading guns firing off, and everything else. We tried to make airborne, airable, air, you know, waterborne, everything in one vehicle. And that didn't work, but some of the stuff that we were doing on low signature, stealth capability, and everything else, as you'll see later on, really did pay off. Any questions up to this point? Because now I'm going to try to hurry up and get through this to the present. Sir?
Number 5 being articulated vehicle. Actually, what number 5?
That's an articulated vehicle. And it's just basically, it's, you know, parts moving and everything else. That's the M561 Gamma Goat. Yeah. If you've ever ridden in one, you'll never want one. that was one of the bad when the Army came out with, real bad. Next slide, Chris. Organizationally, we went into a lot of changes in our recent history. 1986, the Cold Water Defense Act removed all the acquisition functions from the commands and set their own command. So now they took the acquisition logistics and separated them and placed them under a structure we know as the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Acquisition, Logistics, and Technology. And the program managers, guys that actually, you know, are the fleet managers, were now belong to what's called the Program Executive Office structure. And so they control all of that. Base realignment and closure, 1988, 93, 95, and 2005, not only took things away from the command, but also gave things to us. For example, we ended up with 5 depots and arsenals and a production facility. And they form a good part of the industrial base organization that we were talking about earlier, the organic industrial base. We received the Army's watercraft mission, patrolling the water systems, and along with many other missions. But we also lost the tank plant. They had remodeled and brought the Lima Modification Center up to more modern standards back around the late 70s. And the Army decided they were going to build the M1 tanks there instead of in Detroit. And as a result, we built them for a few years, and then all we did was modification work, and Lima did all the tanks. So we ended up losing the tank plant, sold to the city of Warren. So roughly, the tank plant, if you think about that, 3 tanks a day, every single day, for 55 years is what that plant produced. And I don't think we'll ever see that kind of production again. And throughout our history, we've done not only managed all the vehicles, but we also have these guys called logistics area representatives. And these are civilians like myself and like Chris, who deploy overseas with the troops and do maintenance stuff for them. We've been doing that since roughly 1940s, and we're still doing that today, where we have a large number of them. And what they do is they're super mechanics. The maintenance guys that go out and they help the troops do maintenance. This thing right here, TACOM, what the Army did in 2003 is it started separating all its commands. Set up its own separate, took all the research and development engineering centers and put them under one command, and the idea was to focus what they were doing for the Army. We also set up installation management command. So now the mission commander, now no longer had to worry about the pipes and the snow blowing and the rain down the salt and stuff like that. That now belonged to somebody else. Next slide. A little while ago, I was asked by Army Materiel Command, as our senior leadership, they were putting together their 50th anniversary, and they came to me and they said, we want you to look at every single vehicle the Army did by decade and tell us what was most important. So what we did is we talked about this huge list and said, you know what, we need to break it down. So this is kind of where I came up with it, and I'll tell you why. First off, the armored personnel carrier, like I said, it was a workhorse for the Army in Vietnam. It was both offensive and defensive. Lightweight, versatile, reliable. Made 11 different variants. There's 11 different models of that, including ambulance, mortar carrier, smoke generator, missile carrier, you name it, they could do it. And it was built that way. What was important was it brought something to us that we had forgotten from World War II, and that was a family of vehicles. So like I said, it's 11 variants. If you look at the Sherman tank or the Grant tank, all the different variants that came about on that chassis, on that bed, we had forgotten that over the years. What we were doing was, your Jeep goes down, you need a new Jeep, we give you a new Jeep. We never looked at what the capability or what the capacity of the force was that was going out, and fighting the wars and looking at what they needed. What we were doing is saying, you need a new Jeep, we give you a new Jeep. That was it. What this is now said, we're now looking at the capabilities of the systems that we have, okay, and what they can do and what's needed for what we're projecting in the future. So, this was something we had forgotten. The 113 system brought that back into our consciousness. In the 1970s, the M551 Sheridan was a technological monster and an absolute failure. So why is that important? Anyone want to take a guess?
Don't do it again.
It's an old adage, you learn more from failure than you do from success. So what we learned is we learned the technological mistakes that we made with the Sheridan that ended up canceling programs and streamlining our thought processes to where we ended up building the M1 Abrams tank. So in the 1970s, the technological advances that were done on the Sheridan, which were failed, we were able to go back to the drawing board, reconstitute that, fix the problems, and we ended up building the M1 tank. So for the 1980s, probably the most important vehicle we did was the M1 Abrams main battle tank, and then with it, the Bradley fighting vehicle. Okay, those are two of the big five. The other one is the multiple launch rocket system and the Apache and Black Hawk helicopters. Those are the big five. We do the base for the NLRS, but not the whole missile system. So those two vehicles changed the face of the battlefield and added what was known as operational maneuver back into the force. Fast, accurate, quiet, powerful, able to lock into a target 2 miles away while on the move and hit it. Coupled with Bradley, these two vehicles had a powerful 1-2 punch in armored combat. At 30 years old, the Abrams is still the most dominating presence on the battlefield, while the Bradley continues to provide devastating firepower in a battle formation. And what this did is this added decisive victory back into our consciousness and back into the force. If you remember Desert Storm, it was, what, 96-hour battle, and the M1 tank and the Bradley basically ran over everything, and in 4 days it was all over. But that also created a problem. Next slide. Because we did so good with the tanks and everything else, we now had to rebuild our entire fleet of trucks. And that's what we ended up doing. So in the 1990s, that's kind of what we did. We had to make sure the support systems could keep up with the armor systems in combat. And so what we did is we completely revitalized the entire wheeled vehicle fleet. So we can get ammo, food, supplies, and fuel to keep pace with the armored force. They also could haul more equipment, and they can also carry more weight. What you see here is what we call a palletized loading system, and that basically lifts flat racks full of supplies and drops them, and people just grab them from there. And we ended up with two different families of vehicles. One was called medium tactical, and the other was called heavy tactical, and that's where your tank transporters and things like that come from. In 2000, we ended up, General Shinseki said he wanted to change the face of the way the Army went to war. And he said he wanted a fast, lightweight vehicle that could be anywhere within 96 hours and to bring a whole brigade of them in contact. The result of that is a Striker. And this here is a Striker in Iraq, roughly about 2010, 2011, with probably about 40 or 50 different modifications on the regular vehicle. Okay? And like there's some reasons for all that. But what this did is it changed the whole force structure of the Army. One vehicle changed how we go to war, how we now structure ourselves, and everything else. But it also gives, as far as a brigade combat team versus the old division. But what this also does is it gives the commander who's going to war the ability to plug and play systems. He can put in as much heavy or infantry or Striker as he needs for support brigade combat teams that will be coming online soon. And again, after years and years and years of going with the heavy tank and the infantry, this is what we're now going to war in. So with that in mind, you kind of ask yourself, so what happens in the future? Well, that's what we're working on right now. We're working on the next generation of vehicles. The first one is called the Joint Light Tactical Vehicle. It's heavier and more robust than the Humvee. It's going to replace the Humvee in battle formations. It's basically, that's designed for combat operations versus the Humvee that never was. Humvee's now about 30 years old. Can't expand it much more than we already have. Can't add any more weight to it than we already have. And I'll show you a picture of an armored one in a little bit. The Humvee is going to remain within the system, but in a non-combat role. The other thing we're going to be building is called the Armored Multi-Purpose Vehicle. And that's going to replace the 113 that I showed you earlier, the Armored Personnel Carrier. And it's going to come with its own family of vehicles. So again, we're keeping that family of vehicles. Striker is a family of vehicle, and so will all these other systems we're bringing on board. After 50 years, there's nothing we can do with the 113 anymore. It's reached the end of its life. We can't do anything more to it. We can't add anything more to it. We can't even replace parts on it anymore. And finally, it's a ground combat vehicle, and we're looking at it as a replacement for the Bradley. Changes in vehicle technology and threats faced in warfare are making Bradley almost obsolete. So those are the three systems we're looking at in the future. So, next chart. This is how we fit into the world of the Army. This is us right here. And if you'll see, right below us, we have our logistics people. Those are our depots, our arsenals, and our integrated logistics support center. Remember I told you our 3 core competencies are acquisition, logistics, and technology? Acquisition is over on this side, falling under the Assistant Secretary of the Army. And on the other side is technology. That's all the Research Development Engineering Center. Is all falling under the Research Development Engineering Command. These people all report to the Army Materiel Command, and nowhere do we meet until you get to the Secretary of the Army level. So there's really not a lot of, so we have to actually talk to each other and be nice and coordinate and everything else. And we do a better job of that than any of the other commands around because we have to. There's too much that depends on it. We also have the Marines, and we have their light armored vehicle. The Marine LAV is an LAV-2, the Canadians use an LAV-3, the Strikers an LAV-3.5. Same vehicle, same base of the vehicle. Next slide. This will give you an idea of where we are and what we do. About 21,000 people, most of us are civilians. We're in 110 locations around the world. We're in Iraq, we're in Afghanistan, we're in Kuwait, Jordan, Egypt, Japan, all over the world. These little symbols here, those are all our little logistics